Connor, I believe even if Nick Saban's still coaching in Alabama, this may be a tough point to make and a hard case to make. But I believe that Georgia's trip to Texas, because Texas was in the college football playoff, I think there's a chance that's the bigger game for Georgia, no matter what. Even if Saban's still at Alabama, but given the current landscape of the schedule, there's no doubt Georgia-Texas on paper right now is the biggest regular season game of this year, and one of the biggest regular season games that Georgia's played in gosh knows when.
I actually have doubt on that.
Really?
I think the Georgia-Alabama game is more important for Georgia to win
Okay.
rather than Georgia-Texas, because I think if Georgia wins that Alabama game, it very clearly just turns into, I think, a Georgia versus Nick Saban narrative. Whereas if they lose that Alabama game, it's maybe Georgia does have some issues with the way Alabama does things. Now, I understand your line of thinking, and it'll certainly, I think, bore itself out over the season. I think you look at the way Texas has been built under Steve Sarkisian with them. I think one of the things that went unnoticed, yes, you talk about the offensive skill players, Quinn Ewers, obviously. They've done a very, very good job of building on the lines of scrimmage. Now, they got to replace a lot of their star defensive linemen, and I'll be interested in seeing how they go about doing that. But you look at this offensive line, it's one of the better ones in the country next season. And so I think going forward into 2024, I think maybe Georgia, Texas could go on to become what maybe Georgia, Alabama had been in the recent years in the SEC. It's a big game. It's got a national championship type feel to it. It could very well be a national championship game in 2024. But I think for the next upcoming season, with the fact that Alabama is on the schedule and the fact that, yes, you do have to replace Nick Saban, and it's the first game without him on the sidelines there, I think because of that and the history that Georgia has had with Alabama, I think you have to successfully close that book first before you start writing your next one with Texas.
I think it's a fair point. It's an interesting point, too, from the standpoint you don't want to gift Kalen DeBoer kind of a kickstart to begin his era there as head coach. So I think the point you're making is certainly a fair one. Speaking of Alabama, to finish up our conversation here today, Connor, obviously I love anytime that you can, kind of go back and forth with the Bama folks. I enjoy doing that. But that doesn't mean it's not like a legitimate discussion either. The Ryan Grubb stuff is not good in my mind. And the fact that the Seattle Times, on the record, essentially reported they were clearly waiting until the end of that 30-day transfer window to announce that Grubb was going to be the Seahawks offensive coordinator. Connor, I think this is bad on two fronts. A, Alabama for now is sort of without an OC, although I guess Kalen DeBoer could be that guy himself. But B, you're essentially lying to your own players, and I do think this is the kind of thing that ought to be used against them. You better believe that if it was me, I'd be saying, "Are you really want to go there?" Given how they've treated their players throughout all of this, am I wrong for saying that? That I'd make a big deal about this, maybe no matter what, but this actually might be a big deal.
No, Centennial High School alum Mike McDonald, I think maybe perhaps played a part in this and recognizes that there can be some negative recruiting implications that come with Alabama from this, because we talked about this as well on the front end with Nick Saban and when he chose to announce his retirement. I think that played a significant role in sort of the way that roster took shape and how things turned out there. And Ryan Grubb's a fantastic play caller. He is someone that I'm not surprised an NFL team has brought in. I think it makes a lot of sense for him to stay in the Seattle area and take that job. I think the Seattle Seahawks offensive coordinator is a better job at this point than the Alabama offensive coordinator job. And so it's certainly an interesting thing. And as we move forward here, look, Alabama knows they're already fighting an uphill battle when it comes to some of the losses they've had on the roster this year. Now you lose a coach who it's been very weird about how Grubb was sort of involved with Alabama, because they never formally announced him as the offensive coordinator. There was no press release. There was none of that, but he was out on the road recruiting for them. He was making appearances at Alabama touchdown clubs. And so, the maybe cloak and dagger aspect of this, I believe Grubb was the last coordinator to be hired by an NFL team this season. It's very interesting, and there is maybe perhaps something to that, where Grubb trying to protect his longtime friend in Kalen DeBoer before heading out. I certainly think that there is an interesting angle to that, and I'll be interested in seeing if there are any repercussions of that moving forward. I know, we talked about how big it was for Alabama to land Ryan Williams. I think the presence of Ryan Grubb absolutely played a factor in that. And so it's not a coincidence to me that this move all happens not just after National Signing Day, but also after that 30-day transfer portal window closes, because that news was announced
Yeah.
at around 11:45 on Friday night, and by 12:01 that portal window had closed shut.
So let me ask you two quick follow-ups, and then I'll let you go. Do you think there's a chance they always knew that Ryan Grubb wasn't going to be the offensive coordinator, and they brought him here strictly for the window dressing of making it seem like a good OC is in place? I mean, obviously, that's a lot of speculation. But if that's the case, they knew, because not announcing him officially, not having him on the website, things like that, certainly makes it seem like they knew there was at least a very good chance he could be going on to the NFL. I think Greg Burns said they always had a contingency plan if he did do that, which is not the kind of thing you would typically have for somebody you just hired. Do you think there's a chance they always knew that Grubb was likely not to be in Tuscaloosa? Because if they went through all this pomp and circumstance for a guy they didn't believe was going to be here, Connor, I think we're talking about a completely different set of circumstances, if that's indeed the situation.
I don't think so, because Grubb, I think, very much wanted the Washington head coaching job. He made that clear. And when it was certain that he wasn't going to get that job, it became clear that he was going to go to Alabama. So I do think that there was a point in time where Grubb envisioned himself as being the Alabama offensive coordinator for the 2024 season. But once I think the NFL cycle opened up, and I think, again, he had a chance to return to Washington, he's not going to have to move his family. Hopefully he hadn't sold his house already. I think at that point, Greg Byrne, being the athletic director that he is, probably moved pretty quickly, knowing that there is a chance that he goes back and takes that job again. I think so much of this is being prepared and having a plan. And so I think the Nick Saban retirement showed the importance of that. And I think this Ryan Grubb move is just the latest example of that.
All right, very quickly, final thing, and I want to be as fair as possible. I really want as objective of an answer as we're capable of coming up with here. Do you think that Kalen DeBoer is off to a bad start as Alabama head coach? They lost Caleb Downs. They don't have an offensive coordinator. On the other hand, they do hold on to Ryan Williams, which is a pretty big, I think, recruiting win for kind of a first-time head coach here. Just sort of binary choice. Do you think that Kalen DeBoer is off to a bad start as Alabama head coach?
I'm going to give you an unsatisfactory answer. Yes, I think he's off to a bad start. But I think whoever stepped into that role was going to be off to a bad start because of the enormity of Nick Saban's shadow and the fact that I think so many players went to Alabama to play for Nick Saban. I can't give an honest assessment of how DeBoer would have handled this because, to be frank, I'm going to give the doomsday scenario. Let's say Alabama had hired Kirby Smart. I don't know how well Kirby Smart would have done with all of that. Probably a little bit better than DeBoer, only because of the cachet that he has already in the South. But Dan Lanning could have come in there and had some of the same issues that DeBoer is having. So yes, to answer the question honestly, it hasn't been, I think, an ideal start for Kalen DeBoer. But I think Alabama knows and probably always knew whoever was stepping in for Nick Saban was going to have a difficult transition. And so I think when you look at DeBoer and where he excels the most on game days, game management, I think that's a big reason why Alabama went out and brought him in, knowing that he's going to be able to get the most out of the talent on this roster in this coming time, and hope that you're able to play catch up on recruiting in the back end. Because I think if the results slip first and you brought in a coach who is more recruiting minded in that aspect, I think that's maybe a little bit more worrying long term.